Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. My friend Branko Milanovic, the former chief economist at the World Bank, has a new book out. It's called The Great Global Transformation, and it focuses on what comes after neoliberalism. So in our conversation with Branko Milanovic, I began by asking him that very question: what comes after neoliberalism?
Well, what comes after neoliberalism is something that I call national market liberalism. The idea is the following. If you think of liberalism as a consistent ideology, it has two components at least, actually even four, but let's stay with two. The two components are domestic and international. The domestic component is, we know quite well, it's actually liberal policies on taxation, protection of property rights, deregulation, and so forth. On the international side, you have the equivalent of that, which is free trade, free circulation of capital and labor, low tariff rates, and so forth. So what I argue is that the second component, the international component, will be gone. And actually we see it under Trump that it is basically changed. So you might have the domestic component, which gets even maybe deeper, but then the foreign component becomes mercantilistic. So that was the origin of the term national market liberalism. And just to put it kind of in a simpler way, think of socialism, which likewise was an internationalist and cosmopolitan ideology like liberalism. When you put the prefix or the adjective national in front, what do you get?
You remember, Branko, that there was a term, I think it was used in the 60s by some Czech idealists. They talk about socialism with a human face.
Right.
Might we describe the post-neoliberal world as capitalism with a nationalist face?
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. You know, I didn't put it like that in the book, yes, but I think actually we would see actually domestic neoliberalism with very strong nationalist component when it comes to foreign economic relations and generally to competition between the countries. So yes, I think it's a very good comparison.
So if it is capitalism with a national face or a nationalist face, is that nationalism triggered by politics or by economics? Because you're an economist,
Right.
but you're very interested also in the political dimensions or the political economy of global capitalism. Is this turn towards nationalism, is it driven by an economic logic or a political cultural logic?
I think, of course, that's kind of an easy answer to say that it's both. But if you were really to push me to choose between economic logic and political, I would choose economic, and I'll explain it. I think in the case of let's start with the United States. I think in the case of the United States, the Trumpist, the counter-revolution, what I call, is really driven by the unhappiness of large segments of the population with neoliberal globalization. And that unhappiness is not cultural, in my opinion. That unhappiness is really unhappiness with the level of growth or absence of growth of income during the last 20 or 30 years. And similarly, because I don't look only at Trump, you look at Xi Jinping and I look at Putin, I think that the reaction in China was also driven by the greater importance of rich capitalists in the political bodies like Communist Party of China. And the reaction against that is sort of something that gave sustenance or maybe gave the ideology to Xi Jinping. So I do think actually that economic forces were quite important, or maybe the dominant forces.
So does this represent, Branko, a convergence of the US and China? Are the models that Trump is pursuing and Xi in Beijing, are they basically the same models of nationalist capitalism?
Well, yes, actually, I think there are some similarities. I am not going to push it too far because, as you know, actually, in Capitalism alone, I argued that there are two forms of capitalism: liberal capitalism of the United States, as a sort of most important example, and political capitalism of China. It is true that actually there are some elements, neoliberal elements, but yet political, that we see in the current administration that make the US more similar to China. I would not, however, overdo that similarity, but yes, I would argue that, as we were saying in the very beginning, that national liberalism, or sort of national market liberalism, what I call, may be somewhat similar in the two. But I think there are still differences between China and the United States, in particular in the Chinese attempts under Xi Jinping to maintain the autonomy of the state decision making.
Branko, you're an economic historian too. Have there been other moments in history where we've had this national capitalism?
I think we did. Actually, we did have moments like that, and actually we had periods like that. I was quite influenced by the book which came, I think, towards the end of my writing, or maybe even when I finished my book. It was by French economic historian Orin. And that is actually, that talks about what he calls the capitalism of, in French, finitude. It's like capitalism of the finiteness. And in his view, there were periods where you had, in the 17th, 18th century, very strong competition between different capitalist powers. Actually, these were sort of nascent capitalist powers, but the neo-mercantilist or mercantilist point of view of the world was very much present there. And then there are periods, he argues, when we see trade and competition as a non-zero-sum game. And I think that what we are now witnessing, we are entering a period where we see essentially the competition as a zero-sum game. Ideologically, I don't think that it is driven by the lack of natural resources or objectively by factors that have changed. I think that ideologically we see it as a competition between the states.
Liberals view nationalism as a scam of one kind or another, whether it's Gellner or so many other critics of nationalism. But in an economic sense, Branko, is there an argument for national capitalism? Could it theoretically, I mean, of course, you get two or three economists in a room and you have two or three arguments and views of the world, but is there a credible economic case to be made in favor of capitalist nationalism or national capitalism?
Well, as you know, Andrew, as you said, actually, you put two economists in the room and we've got two different answers.
Or three.
Then you get three answers. There has been an argument. Let me, for example, mention also Swiss economic historian Paul Barak, who actually argued that periods of protectionism in many countries were linked with higher growth rates. And without going into all the details, you can definitely see that Prussian and then German nationalism and protectionism did actually make Germany really a credible competitor to the UK in the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century. Russia developed extremely fast under Sergei Wittes policies, which are really policies of national protectionism and in domestic investment and so forth. So there were periods, including the United States. After all, Alexander Hamilton is famous for creating sort of national protectionism in the United States with high tariff rates and the development of the industrial power of the United States. Actually, so I would be rather, I'm not saying agnostic, but I think there may be instances where domestic nationalism is sort of capable of leading to high growth rates.
They made a very successful musical out of Hamilton's capitalist nationalism or national capitalism. Maybe some Russian screenwriter should do the same thing for Sergei Witt. Branko, we've had Gary Gerstle on the show many times. He's perhaps the best historian of neoliberalism. It's always assumed, or I think certainly by liberals, it's always assumed that what would come after a neoliberalism would somehow be a less selfish, a less inegalitarian, a less offensive model of capitalism. But what you seem to be suggesting in this new book is, in moral terms, it's actually, if not, it might even be more reprehensible. Is that fair?
I would say so. I think actually it is sort of, how should I say, I think ideologically, that's where I totally agree with you about nationalism. Ideologically, nationalism in itself has a certain tone, certain part of it, which is always a competition against the other. And the essential view that if we collaborate, we can collaborate or cooperate for a while, but really we have adversarial relationship. And I think this is common to every nationalism. Nationalism really cannot cooperate of free will and openly, in the sense that they would accept the other guys also, winning maybe more than yourself. So I do think that there are certain elements there which are worse than under neoliberalism. The ideology of nationalism is an ideology of combat.
It's your two worlds coming together, Branko, isn't it? You grew up in Serbia. Yeah. You're steeped in Balkan history. You still sound very Serbian, whatever that means. You're all too familiar with Southeast European nationalisms of one kind or other, the smaller, the more violent and selfish. You're also a historian of the global economy and of inegalitarianism. So in a way, this capitalist nationalism represents the convergence of your two worlds.
Yes, one can say that, although, the fact is, I was of the generation that didn't know much. Actually, I started really sort of learning more or less about Serbian history only at the time of the breakup of Yugoslavia. Because when we were growing up in schools, national histories were totally put aside. Basically, the history would start with the ascent of the Communist Party to power. So what you would essentially study was a study of the Communist Party's history. And clearly then industrialization, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, the October Revolution. I was much more familiar, and I knew that much better than any of the Balkan nationalisms that were then treated very much the way that Marx treated them. These were sort of destructive nationalism that actually detracted from the importance of the class struggle. So that's why Marx, for example, thought that all the Balkan nationalism was really sort of forces that were simply used by the aristocracy or landlords in order to offset the workers' movement. So that was the ideological framework within which I grew up. And it's only the wars in Yugoslavia that led me actually to start really studying and reading much more about Southeast European nationalism.
The book got a rave review from Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, another old friend of the show, who argued that it brings a Marxist, and he didn't mean this in a critical sense, he meant it literally, a Marxist reading to our understanding of global national capitalism in the 2020s. But Marx would be turning in his grave in Highgate, Branko, wouldn't he? This idea of a globalization reverting to nationalism. It's so un-Hegelian, it's so against his historical narrative.
No, I agree with that, but I think what Martin had in mind, and I would sort of agree with that description. Methodologically, there is quite a lot of Marx methodologically in the book. I think actually the book in this book I almost don't mention Marx by name, but methodologically when I discuss, for example, the rise of what I call the homoplutic new elite in the United States.
And define the term.
I'm going to define it, yes. The homoplutic elite is something that I define, it's defined by the fact that among the top richest 10% of the people in the United States and other actually European countries, you have an increasing share of people who are rich both in terms of capital income which they receive and labor income. That's what the name homoplutia comes from, saying same wealth, basically equally wealth in terms of human capital and financial capital. Now, let me make 2 points on that. First of all, this is, of course, a very class-based definition, and in that sense, it is Marxist because the class is defined according to your position in the process of production and type of income you receive. But on the other hand, it is not something that Marx would have expected ever, that rich capitalists will be unified in their own persona with rich workers. Because obviously he thought, of course, if you're a rich capitalist, you're not going to double up as a worker. You're going to actually have predominance or 100% of your income coming from property. So there are two elements. I think methodologically I use the class in a Marxist way, but the outcome that we observe now is not something that Marx would have expected at all.
And of course, Weber, developing on Marx, wrote a very influential thesis on the Protestant ethic and the origins of capitalism. It could one argue, you're not a sociologist of capitalism, you're an economist, but do you think that it's possible, Branko, that these incredibly wealthy people are working harder and harder for some sort of salvation of one kind or another? And in that sense, Weber's analysis of capitalism was more accurate than Marx's?
Well, I was, of course, very much influenced, despite the fact that I'm not a sociologist, but I was quite influenced by Weber. And these people, I mean, this new elite that we see in the US and other advanced capitalist countries, and I will come to a moment in comparison with the US with actually less advanced capitalist countries, that elite is a very hard-working elite. I use quite a lot of work of Daniel Markovits in the book, and
another old friend of the show, who's written on the meritocracy. Excellent,
excellent writer, and of course a very astute student of meritocracy, and he sees them as they are a very hard-working meritocracy. It's a hard-working meritocracy which believes that it actually has the right to be rich because they have education, they have hard work, they have very strong ethic, and they, of course, also have very high capitalist incomes. What is interesting there, I would say, in comparison, actually, that's how I opened the chapter. I discussed James Burnham, 1941, managerial revolution. Managerials, according to James Burnham and later by Galbraith and Raymond Aron and others, would actually have an ideology which is not necessarily capitalist. But the current elite has a very capitalist ideology, an ideology which really puts the protection of property rights at the top, which the old writers of managerial class did not think likely.
They didn't think in abstract terms. So in a sense, Branko, we shouldn't be too surprised with the reappearance of socialism and the word socialism in political and ideological terms in the United States with characters like Mandami.
No, well, we should not be, because there is also, I think, there is action and reaction. What I see, if I were to simplify things, we have had a period of like 30 years of neoliberal globalization characterized with what the French called la pensée unique, where actually it was believed that liberal capitalism is the terminus or the end point of history. Everybody would eventually move toward that situation and so forth. We know that. It's clearly no longer valid, and we have a significant change. I will not repeat what I said before about the rise of sort of mercantilist ideology and of nationalism. But then we at the same time have a reaction to that, because the more inequitable capitalism becomes, the more likely it is going to create within itself people who reject sort of capitalism or actually emphasize the inequities which are being brought up. And that's why I think we have at the same time, still marginal, but in existence, the rise of proto-socialist ideologies and views.
Branko, you keep up with the abundancy debate in the United States. Your argument is the reverse of abundancy. The abundancy people seem to suggest that, particularly with AI and new forms of digital technology, that eventually everything will be free. Even Elon Musk has made the argument, I think quite absurdly, particularly given his own history, that money will disappear. And to go back to a young Marx, we'll be free all day to do whatever we like, farm in the afternoon and write poetry in the evening. But your argument is the reverse. It focuses on property, it focuses on the physical. And of course, it's no coincidence that nationalism itself is rooted in soil, in boundaries and territories and hostility to outsiders. So there seems to be some sort of synergy in political terms between these two. Everyone talks about the disappearance of the left and the right, and then no one knows quite how to define or refine these titles for the 21st century. But it seems as if there are two movements. On the one hand, there are the abundancy people, the Ezra Kleins and the other Silicon Valley types. And on the other hand, they're the economic nationalists. So these are the two realities in economic and political terms in the 21st century.
It could be, but let me just say before I answer if these two alternatives are really, how should I say, the only ones that exist. Let me answer. I'm fundamentally disagreement, as you said at the beginning, with the idea that abundance or affluence would be such that actually things would become free and we would not compete for things and we would be actually living lives where division of labor, as you said, actually that was Marx's idea, that actually division of labor would will not exist. We would be, as you said, in
at least the young Marx, the Marx of the German ideology.
And actually Adam Smith also speaks about the deadening impact of the division of labor, because you basically just keep on doing one thing and you cannot develop your abilities. But I'm where I'm disagreeing on the following grounds. What we, I think, observe very strongly is that our needs, our wants, are socially determined. In other words, that there is no such an amount of things that is in abstract and absolute amount sufficient. We are never going, as humans, I believe, I cannot say never, but let's suppose within any foreseeable future, to feel that all our needs are satisfied, because technological progress would always produce new goods, new services, and hence new needs. Now, when the iPhone or cell phone or whatever did not exist 20 years ago, I didn't have the need for it because it didn't exist. I cannot have a need for something which doesn't exist, which I have not seen. But once it is there, I develop the need for that. And consequently, when people say, okay, technological evolution and artificial intelligence will change that, no, it will create new goods, new commodities, and we would be in need of these commodities. So moreover, I would say that greed is actually becoming more important now than it was in the past.
Well, that's the old mantra from the 1980s. Greed is good. Is it any better now or viewed in any different way from Gordon Gekko in Wall Street than it is today in the 2020s when it's articulated by Peter Thiel or Elon Musk?
But you see that the abundance people, to the extent that I understand it, the abundance people believe that the abundance would resolve greed, because if all the products, all the goods become so, there are so many of them, the abundance is so great, then we would actually just grab whatever we need and everybody will get the same thing, or not the same thing. Actually, everybody will be paid, as Marx says, according to their needs. But that I believe really to be very naive and wrong, because the needs are created by technological evolution, and this technological evolution itself is creating the need and the greed. Because once we have the want for something, we also have greed, because greed is essentially a want which is not limited by simply our physical ability to consume things. And that's where the element of, how should I say, the use of commodities and goods to convey the image of wealth and prosperity comes in, because that part has no really upper boundary.
The classical economists like Adam Smith, of course, weren't really economists. They were moral philosophers. They wrote about human happiness. Right. Is this national capitalism, capitalist nationalism, or national capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is it likely, Branko, to make us more miserable? We seem to live in an age of anxiety and misery. We'll go to therapists. No. Even when people have lots of money, they seem to be miserable these days. Is there something about this post-neoliberal economy which lends itself to misery?
I think that we would be, of course, richer, but in some sense, yes, I would agree that if the race for things becomes more and more, and it is actually tougher and more present and thereby tougher, it does make us, despite the material abundance of things, it might make us, and it does make us, actually to some extent more miserable. So I think that the engine of capitalism is greed. Without greed, you just do not have capitalist engine working. That capitalist engine produces more and more things, commodities and other things, but it at the same time, our desire for those things in some extent outpaces even our consumption, and that discrepancy maybe between what we would like to have and what we do have becomes the source of permanent tension. So I'm not expecting happiness.
Which will make everyone watching rather miserable, although they're probably miserable in the first place. It probably
could be, but they should not have unrealistic expectations.
Maybe makes their misery feel more virtuous. Finally, Branko, you're presenting one world.
Yeah.
There are alternatives. I'm guessing, I'm sensing, although you might not acknowledge it, that you're not really a big fan of this post-neoliberalism. It's not something that you welcome. Is there an alternative? Margaret Thatcher famously said about neoliberalism, there is no alternative. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Is the alternative anti-greed? Is it socialism? Or is it some other word that we haven't really come across yet?
Socialism for me, because maybe I'm old-fashioned, the word itself is so ill-defined nowadays. When there was real so-called really existing socialism, it was very clear. It was no private property over capital, centralized coordination, no wage labor. Well, nobody is arguing today for nationalization of property. Nobody is arguing to end wage labor and workers to control the enterprises. Nobody is arguing against decentralized coordination. So I'm not quite sure what people mean by socialism, unless they mean, more of a welfare state, which is still a capitalist state with, of course, greater redistribution and more welfare. So the word socialism, as I said, to me is quite non-defined. But because everybody that can actually understand under socialism whatever he or she wants to understand. But on the other hand, what as I said, I do see actually increase, we talked about increasing greed and in some sense unhappiness. However, I would see one good thing, and it might surprise people, but it is an ideological freedom in the following sense. We do now, because we are in a period of transition, we have many ideology and many packages of different ideological components floating around. So it is not like 30 years ago when if you said something which was against neoliberalism, you were considered like a crazy person, person who actually doesn't have common sense. Nowadays you can actually have much greater ideological freedom to defend things that may not be accepted by some, or to actually combine or recombine elements from different ideologies. So I think we are freer ideologically now.
You didn't answer my question.
Which is what?
Which is, you're talking about some sort of ideological smorgasbord, which is a kind of non-answer. If it's not socialism and it's not national capitalism, Branko, what is it?
Well, look at that. I was, of course, arguing national market liberalism in the sense that, I will not repeat it, but it's in the sense that Trump is doing it to some extent. He is combining things which come from different parts and that represent a new ideological amalgam that is not very easy for us to understand. And that part has a sort of deepening neoliberal traits like deregulation, for example, lower taxation on capital incomes, lower taxation on the high incomes, and on the other hand, total mercantilistic approach to international relations. So it is a new amalgam, that's why I call it national market liberalism. But I think, when I was saying before, I think that us as individuals we are no longer under this sort of ideological pressure to believe that there is only one way to happiness, and that way to happiness was discovered in 1990. I don't think we believe that anymore.
Let me have one final shot at that question. You talked about Trump as an amalgam. I know you're not a fan of Trump.
No.
I'm not, and I'm guessing most of our audience
No.
isn't. Is there an anti-Trump amalgam out there?
Well, the anti-Trump was, of course, the sort of traditional neoliberalism with open borders. So that's one amalgam. So that actually does exist. It's not gone.
But it's not new. You need something new.
No, it's not new. Well, I don't see actually when we talk about socialism and we see actually people who argue for socialism, as I said before, I am very hard pressed when I pin them down to tell me what exactly it means. I just don't get an answer. So let me go back to my point about freedom. Freedom or ideological freedom and freedom from ideological sort of pressure of the common sense in some sense. We could actually have a situation when a different amalgam, which I cannot now tell you what it will be because I don't know, but another amalgam could be formed. So in that sense, yes, I think we have greater freedom and there are alternatives, but these are the one that we mentioned was, of course, the standard neoliberalism. But as I said before, I don't see a socialism as an alternative.
Well, amalgams which will hopefully emerge in the future. As always, Branko Milanovic, author of The Great Global Transformation, National Market Liberalism in a Multipolar World. Real honor to have you, as always, Branko, on the show. And we will certainly have you back in 2026 as we're all searching more and more desperately for that amalgam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. As always, it was a pleasure to be here.